All right, let's be turning over to 1 Samuel chapter 27. 1 Samuel chapter 27. So the last couple of weeks have been some interesting back and forth between Saul and David. Of course, we know that Saul had been hunting David and looking to find him, felt threatened by him, wanted to see him killed, and so he's chasing him through the wilderness. And while hunting him, Saul lands upon a cave, not coincidentally, where David and his men were hiding. And Saul could have been killed had David wanted to, but David spared him. You would have thought that would be the end of it. David reveals himself and says, "Hey, Saul, I had you right here in my hands. I could have, but I didn't." And you would think that would be the end of it, that Saul would see David's loyalty, that Saul would see what David had done, and that would be the end of it. And yet, that wasn't the end of it. Saul again starts the pursuit. David last week was able to walk right through the camp where Saul and his men were stationed. He took the spear that Saul had and made a public showing that David was actually more loyal than Saul's captain, Abner. Abner fell asleep on the job. Abner wasn't protecting his king. And Saul, I had you again. I could have taken your life. You were mine, and I didn't touch you. And so the last episode seemed to be a turning point, because this back and forth has gone on now a couple of times. David now is convinced that nothing that he can do, nothing that he can say is going to change Saul. That everything that Saul has said, maybe if he believed it before, he's certainly not going to believe it again. In chapter 26, we saw that Saul invited David to return with him, and David declined to do so. At the end of chapter 26, David goes and returns to his own place. David certainly no longer trusts Saul. And these events, for a time, are going to plunge David into a very discouraging place. And that's kind of what we want to talk about tonight. Decisions made in discouragement. So let's pick up here with verse number 1. 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse number 1. And that's our first thought tonight, is David's discouragement. David's discouragement. Verse 1. And David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines, and Saul shall despair of me to seek me any more in any coast of Israel. So shall I escape out of his hand. This shows David, at least this first part here, and then you read the remaining verse, and it just kind of builds upon each other, of David being at a very low point. And a quick read through probably doesn't show you the depths of the discouragement that David is in. Now, if the last few chapters have shown us anything, it's certainly that by this point, David must be thinking, what in the world can I do? What could I have done differently? What can I be doing differently? What else is there to do? What else is there for David to say? What else is there for him to prove? Multiple times now, he's not taken vengeance. He has not attacked Saul. He's not taken Saul and done to him what Saul would have done to David had the shoe been on the other foot. He can't trust him. And now David is convinced that Saul is going to continue coming for him until he is successful. David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. And in that discouragement, David makes a decision that you and I wouldn't have thought possible just a short time ago. he decides to leave the land of Israel and go to the land of the Philistines. He says, there is nothing better than for me than that I should escape or speedily escape into the land of the Philistines, and Saul shall despair of me to seek me any more in any coast of Israel. So shall I escape out of his hand. David decides that his only remedy, his only consolation is, I have to leave. I have to leave my homeland. Saul is going to kill me. If I stay anywhere in Israel, they're going to find me, they're going to kill me. The only thing I can do is leave. I have to leave Israel. I want to notice just a couple of things here, just by way of comment. First of all, I want to say that even the most faithful men are not beyond times of depression, anxiety, fear, doubt, or discouragement. We are not going to stand here for a minute and pretend that David is a weak man, one who has fought battles for Israel, been valiant in war, whether it was one-on-one against the giant Goliath or whether it was leading his men against the Philistines and others in battle. David is not a weak man. David is not a sissy. David is not a crybaby. David is not a wimp. That's not what this is about. We're also not going to pretend that David's not a faithful man. It takes a brief, quick reading of some of the Psalms that we've referenced before to know how David looks to the Lord, to show his trust in the Lord. And he has shown trust in the Lord before. When he has been betrayed by the Ziphites, when he's hiding from Saul in different places, when he's been driven from his home and his wife has to let him out so that he can escape. David has relayed to us Psalms in those conditions and in those times that show his heart for the Lord, his trust for the Lord, his recognition that God had delivered him. So David's not a weak man, and David's not an unfaithful man. David has proven himself. But this last episode has shown David Saul's true colors. He spared Saul's life, and the thanks that he got was that Saul gave his wife to another man. And then Saul started right back on the hunt. No matter the good it seems that David was willing to do to Saul, it's clear that the favor is never going to be returned. And he's incredibly discouraged. And we're not talking about a fleeting, thing. We're not talking about a passing instance. This is war on David, right? Chapter after chapter, you and I have read it. And you and I have read a chapter a week, and you and I have come by and nibbled at these stories. You're talking about someone who for months and months has lived this and lived on the run, and this has war on him. These high points and these low points, these times of deliverance and these times of fear and these times of victory and these times of worry, this roller coaster of emotion, this roller coaster of circumstances is starting to wear on him. You and I aren't above that happening to us. Faithful people aren't above that happening to them. As the events of this world wear on people, as it wears on believers, all of us are subject to bouts of discouragement. So let me say that first. Even the most faithful men, David and others, are prone to bouts of discouragement. Let me say this secondly. Discouragement is powerful. It can make you say things and do things that are out of character. Do you remember what we read last week? Chapter 26, verse 19. Listen to this again. Once David had revealed himself again to Saul, chapter 26, verse 19, he said this, "Now therefore I pray thee, let my Lord the king hear the words of this, of his servant. If the Lord have stirred thee up against me, let him accept an offering." Right? David says, if the Lord stirred you up, I'll make the offering right now and settle it before God. Now, obviously, that wasn't it. So he says, but if they be the children of men, if it's men that are doing this, cursed be they before the Lord, for they have driven me out this day from abiding in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Remember how we talked about that last week? Last week, David was willing to curse these men that attempted to drive him out of Israel, that attempted to drive him out of a place where he could have fellowship and where he could worship God openly, publicly, corporately. And David was willing to pronounce a curse on any man that would rob him of that. And now you get to chapter 27, verse 1, and he's going to do it himself. He's going to leave. He says, I can't stay. Saul is going to kill me, and there is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines. David, just previous to this, cursed those that would try and drive him out. David loves the Lord, and David loves Israel. And if I had told you a couple of weeks ago that, you know what, this is going to get to the point where David just gets up and leaves, you'd have thought, no, David loves Israel. He loves fighting for God's people. He loves fighting for the Lord. If him and Saul are still spatting back and forth and he's on the run, at least he'll find his hiding places, but he won't abandon Israel. He won't leave Israel. And now he does. And honestly, you and I know the kind of man that David is in character. If there was somebody that said, David, you're in trouble, you need to leave, you better get out of the land of Israel, there's part of David that would have probably bucked against that and like, no, I'm not leaving. Cursed be the man that robs me of the inheritance in Israel. That is the power of discouragement. It's not uncommon to see people in discouragement make decisions that might be out of character. Maybe make decisions, do something that a week ago they wouldn't have done. Or if they were thinking with a clear head and the circumstances were different, they would say, no way, it would never come to that. I would never make that kind of decision. But he's overwhelmed. He is in the depths of discouragement, and he's bothered and he's worried. I would say this. Thirdly, again, that discouragement is powerful. It'll make you say things that you might not mean. It'll make you say things that maybe not make any sense. Sometimes it'll make you exaggerate. Listen to that phrase again in verse number 1. There's nothing better for me. Come on, really? Doesn't that seem like a little bit of an exaggeration? Like this is it. This is as good as it gets. There's nothing better. I have to go. Haven't we seen that God has protected David through all this? We have. We've seen that God has protected David each step of the way. And it was so evident that up to this point, we have started seeing bits and pieces of Israel come around to the idea that, you know what? David's going to be the next king, isn't he? Jonathan recognized it. Even Saul recognized it. Even though Saul's trying to put a stop to it, he at least recognized it. And men and women are starting to gather around the idea that David's going to come through this, and God's going to give David that throne. Every attempt of Saul has failed. And yet now David feels like his only hope is to leave Israel and hope that Saul gets tired of looking for him. Right? Verse 1. Saul shall despair of me to seek me any more in any coast of Israel. That's interesting for him to say that. There's nothing better for me here. Is that true? No, but he feels that way. And that's the grip that discouragement and despair can have on faithful people. Now, you and I look at what David does here, and we would say, you know, that doesn't show much faith, or that shows a lack of faith. This is not a very trusting or believing response from David. No, it isn't. And yet, it's amazing the poor decisions that we can make sometimes, and the way that we respond to things when we get discouraged. It's easy to look at this and because it's on print, right? It's on paper. And it's totally out of character for David. And it doesn't seem like something that 5 minutes ago he would have done. And yet, when you and I get discouraged, we exaggerate, don't we? You and I don't maybe not say, well, there's nothing better for me here in Israel. I might as well run to the Philistines. But you and I assume that some of our problems are the end of the world, that we're not going to make it through it. And you might ridicule David and say, well, you know, David used to trust God. Now he's just hoping that Saul runs out of energy, you know, and gives up. I think that we need to learn, and I have to learn this because I'm not always the best at this, but you have to learn to show grace to people who are in discouragement. I'm not saying that it excuses poor judgment or poor decisions, right? But there are people that maybe make poor decisions or poor judgment calls if they lean into discouragement, if they lean into those situations. And you and I, maybe we're prone, if somebody makes a poor judgment or they make a poor decision in discouragement, and we might think, oh, see that was a dumb decision. I knew all along that all of this was for show. They're a fake. They're a put on, and the time would tell. Time would prove whether they were real. And look, discouragement comes, and they make a dumb decision. You think David's fake? You don't think David's the real deal? It doesn't mean that all of those statements are for naught. Is everything that David prayed or all the Psalms that he's written so far, do they just mean nothing now? No, he made a poor decision, right? It wasn't a good decision. It was made in discouragement. It was a lack of faith. Some of the things that he said. It doesn't excuse it. It does show how real life is and how real and powerful discouragement can be. And people, when they're discouraged, always don't need me over their shoulder. Have you just tried not being discouraged? Right? I always love that meme, right? For like the movie Lion King, where you know, Simba goes off and he's all worried about, you know, what's happened back at home. And here come Timon and Pumbaa like, Hakuna Matata, no worries. Have you just tried not thinking about it? Like, that's not real life, right? This is real life. Discouragement is real. And David's made a poor decision. And yet it shows the realness of his life and the situation that he's in. And it's possible for all of us to do that. And the decision that he makes when he's feeling low wasn't a great decision. So when you and I get discouraged, and I dare say when, not if, because those times come, let's be cautious of how our mind and our heart start running and potentially start thinking things that we might not have thought when days were better. Don't rush to decisions. When you're discouraged, when you're downhearted, when you're worried, or when you're anxious, don't rush in decision making. Okay, don't assume the end of the world. Don't assume that God's abandoned you and left you to figure this one out on your own. Okay, take time, be cautious, be thoughtful. David is super discouraged here. And he now feels that his only hope is, I have to leave and just hope and just wait him out and hope that he gives up. Discouragement is real and it's powerful. And we pray that God give us grace in our times of discouragement and help us to be gracious and helpful to each other in each other's episodes of that. And I have not, like I said, I've not always been very good at that. And I need to get better at it because better men than me have gone through discouragement and made poor decisions, and it's not one bit evidence that they're weak or that they don't love the Lord or that they've completely given up, as we'll see in this chapter. Now, number 2, let's talk about David and the Philistines. Because verse number 2 says, David arose and he passed over with the 600 men that were with him unto Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. Now here's where David leads his men. If that name sounds familiar, it should. It's the same name back from chapter 21 where David had fled on a previous occasion. Now, there is some debate whether this is the same Achish, or if the king of Gath named Achish, or what that name represents or means, if it's the exact same person. It is the exact same king as far as kingdom, as far as the region. He goes to Gath, the same place that he went to previously and had to pretend that he was insane, right? The whole foaming at the mouth incident and all that he pretended to be to get out of trouble. Now he's going to them willingly. In verse number 3, it says, "And David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men," and get this part too, "every man with his household, even David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's wife." That's another reason, right? Side note, that's where you got to be really, really careful on decisions that you make, because you have an influence. David's decision not only impacted him, it impacted the lives of 600 men and all of their families. You know, if I make a stupid decision in discouragement, whatever the emotion, right? If I get mad, or I get discouraged, or I just get frustrated, and I leave, and I up and leave, right? Man, I hate my job. Things can't get any worse here. Anywhere else would be better off than here. And I tell them, you know, and I'm moving. I'm leaving. I'm getting out of here. I'm going somewhere else. Well, guess what? 5 people are going with me, because none of them are old enough yet to not go with me. Well, one of them's old enough to not go with me, but she's going to anyway. You got to be careful, right? When you make decisions, David's decision didn't just impact him. There's 600, not just men, 600 families, 600 households. That the decision that he's made, it's trickled down now, right? All right, verse 4. "It was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him." Saul gives up the chase. So David accomplished his immediate goal from verse number 1, right? And yet we're not entirely sure he's in a better place for it, are we? So sometimes the immediate goal, accomplished, recognized, not necessarily better off. Verse 5, David said unto Achish, "If I have now found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in thy country, that I may dwell there. For why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee?" David requests the king give him a place, a city, a place he can call his own, a place he can run as a base for his men and their families. And Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Wherefore Ziklag pertaineth unto the kings of Judah unto this day. Now, if you recall, Ziklag is a city that was in the nation of Israel. It was a city that was mentioned as Joshua was dividing up inheritances. But apparently Israel had somewhere along the line either failed to capture it originally, or had captured it and had been driven out somewhere along the way. But this place, Ziklag, is just to the east. It's in the southern region of Judah. It's to the east of where Gath is. And the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was a full year and 4 months. This wasn't a short thing, right? This is not a short time. A year and 4 months he was there. And David and his men went up and invaded the Geshurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites, for those nations were of old, the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest to Shur, even unto the land of Egypt. Now, while David is there and using Ziklag as a base, he begins to invade some of the surrounding territories. What you find is David actually begins to attack, as it mentions, nations of old. Some of these old enemies that Israel had. One of them that's mentioned here is the Gezrites. Turn real quick to Judges chapter 1. Judges chapter 1 mentions the Gezrites. The Gezrites were the remnants of a people that Israel failed to remove in the previous generations. Notice this in Judges chapter 1, verse 29. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer. The Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Israel is still living with the old enemies that they were supposed to drive out when they first occupied the land. So David starts to invade, start to raid, and start to attack some of these. It mentions the Amalekites in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 25. This is probably a more familiar name than the Gezerites or the Gezrites. We know the stories about the Amalekites. They've been a thorn in the side of Israel since they left the land of Egypt. And notice what this says in Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. Deuteronomy 25:17. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when ye were come forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary, and he feared not God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God hath given thee rest from all thine enemies round about, in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Thou shalt not forget it. God told them before they ever went into the promised land that when you get into that land, and I give you that land of rest, I don't ever want to hear from Amalek again. I don't ever want to hear about Amalek again. You utterly destroy them. Thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. If David is still fighting battles against the Amalekites, what does that mean? That means that for generations now, Israel still hasn't done this, right? If they had done this, there wouldn't be any Amalekites left to fight. But David, using Ziklag as a base, he starts to attack, and he starts to invade these regions of Israel's enemies. Now, I want you to see that there is at least then that bit of encouragement for us to know that David, though discouraged and possibly lingering in that discouragement in moving his family and his men and into the Philistine areas and then staying there for a while, he still has a zeal. We're not talking about him not loving the Lord. We're not talking about him turning into some weak, pathetic, puny guy, right? He made a bad decision, and yet you can still see that he's got a zeal, and he's starting to fight against the inhabitants of the land that are still there that should have been driven out generations ago. David's cleaning up messes that are lingering from the time of the judges, from the time of Joshua and just afterwards. He's dealing with a number of Israel's enemies, even if the Philistines, technically right now, he's not attacking or considering part of that. And when David fights a battle, you probably shouldn't stand in his way. We've talked about David before. We've talked about how his warrior spirit and mentality. What does verse 9 say? And David smote the land, and left neither man nor woman alive, and took away the sheep, and the oxen, and the asses, and the camels, and the apparel, and returned, and came to Achish. David's not afraid to fight. And when he fights, David plays for keeps. David is strong. David is a fearless warrior when it's time to do battle. And it says there in those verses how when David goes to battle, it's probably not a good idea to stand in his way. And he goes and he finds great victory against these enemies. And then in verse 10, and Achish said, Whither have ye made a road today? Where you been? When he gets back, Achish, the king of Gath, wants to hear the results. What you been up to? Where you been? And David said, against the south of Judah, and against the south of the Jerahmeelites, and against the south of the Kenites. Now, what does that mean when he says that? Well, David's not being completely honest here, is he? Who's David been warring with? Well, the Geshurites, the Amalekites, the Gezrites. Now, what does he tell Achish? Hey, David, where you been? Oh, southern Judah, region over there. Just vague enough, right, to be factually correct. Yeah, he was in that region, but you can tell that he's making it sound like what? Like he's been fighting Judah, like he's been fighting Israel. He's been fighting of the tribes that are occupying that region. You see the difference there when David says against the south of Judah. He doesn't actually say the people he's really been fighting against. He really just kind of, I've been over here, southern Judah. And in lying, he's obviously making an attempt to gain favor with Achish and not be truly forthcoming of what he's been up to. Because he knows that if he's forthcoming about what he's been up to, the Philistines are going to turn against him. They're going to remember, oh, that David's back. The David that wars against God's enemies. What does it say in verse 11? David saved neither man nor woman alive to bring tidings to Gath, saying, lest they should tell on us, saying, so did David, and so will be his manner all the while he dwelleth in the country of the Philistines. That's one of the reasons why David took the vengeance and the full spectrum of judgment. You leave people alive and the word starts to spread. David knows that word's going to get back to the Philistines, and they're going to think I'll do the same thing with them. So he's not honest about it with Achish. Oh, I've been down here in southern Judah, and makes it appear that he's been fighting against Israel, even though you and I know that he hasn't been. And chapter 27 ends in kind of a unique way. It says, and Achish believed David, saying, he hath made his people Israel utterly to abhor him. Therefore he shall be my servant forever. Achish believes David. He's fighting against his own people. He's turned against them, or they've turned against him, whatever the case may be. Now they're going to abhor David, and the king, Achish, feels like he's got an ally in David. He believes him, he trusts him, and he says, therefore he shall be my servant forever. It's almost like there's an alliance there. At least the king feels that way, right? And you get to the end of this chapter, and we're not really sure what to think, are we? This place that David had once pretended to be insane at, for fear of them, now he's buddy-buddy with the king? They're on good terms? The king thinks so. And so chapter 28, verse 1, says that it came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare to fight with Israel. And Achish said unto David, know thou assuredly, thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men. We're going to fight us some Israelites. You're in, right, David? This king is convinced that Israel hates David now, and that David's willing to war against them. And so in that courage and in that confidence, he prepares a battle to go up against the Israelites and against King Saul. And he says, hey, David, you're with me, aren't you? Know thou surely that thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men. And David said to Achish, surely thou shalt know what thy servant can do. I'll show you what I can do. Surely thou shalt know what thy servant can do. And Achish said to David, therefore will I make thee keeper of mine head forever. David, I'll elevate you to my very own captain, my very own bodyguard. You stick with me. And he's ready to go to battle against Israel with David at his side. And we're going to stop there, because verse number 3 starts a different context about Saul, which we'll get into next time. It's kind of a parallel story, something that's going on at the same time. But you're left kind of in a perplexed situation, right? If you don't know the rest of the story, if you don't know what comes next, you don't know what to think here. Did David turn against Saul? Is he going to go to battle against him? Why is David now friendly with Philistines? you're just left kind of perplexed, right? You're like, this seems so out of character for David. Is this the David that we had been reading about? The guy that was once afraid to be around the Philistines and feigned incompetence and insanity? Now they're shaking hands and going to battle together? It's weird. It's a weird story. It's a weird situation. And as time develops, as we get into it in the next couple of contexts, we're going to see how this plays out. But it's a cautionary tale, right? It's a tale for us to take lesson from or to take note from. Choices or decisions that are made in discouragement have long-lasting impact. David's been gone over a year now, right? He's been gone a year and 4 months. He's kind of lingered. The decisions that he made is put him in another place, and he's been there a while. And now you're kind of starting to wonder, what's up with David? Where's his loyalties? What's going on with him? How did he get to this point? Be careful, right? And this would not be any attempt at all to ever speak judgment against someone that makes a poor decision in the face of overwhelming anxiety or discouragement. But it's a lesson for us to know that when we have those times in life of deep depression or discouragement or anxiety, we got to try really hard not to make decisions that could have really long-lasting impact. Let's ask that God give us grace and help not to do things that are out of character, and help us stay the course and be faithful. David still has that spark. David, in his fear, in his worry, in his anxiety, he has a zeal. He has a zeal for the Lord, and he wants to defeat Israel's enemies. And yet at the same time, you're perplexed that, like, is he really going to go to battle with the Philistines? So just be cautious, okay? God give us help, that when we're discouraged and we're depressed, that God protect our minds and our thoughts. You know how this started? David said in his heart, and the things that you stew on and the things that you allow to boil in your heart in times of discouragement, be cautious of those. They could have long-lasting impacts, all right? Father, we do ask that you give us help.